Welcome once again to the Radical Imagination. I'm your host, Jim Vrettos, and I'm a sociologist at John Jay College here in New York City. As America's political and cultural climate inexorably continues to heat up, critics and resistors to the Trump era are describing the moment increasingly in terms of a struggle against fascism. American left progressives have historically used various terms to describe the struggle against the ideological right. Conservatives, the radical right, the far right, ultra-conservatives, reactionaries, nativists, McCarthyites, Ku Klux Klanners, white supremacists, advocates of the prison military-industrial complex, John Birchers, the Tea Partiers, the Christian right, the alt-right, the terms go on and on and on. When fascism and neo-Nazism become the terms used, it indicates a sharp shift in the debate and perceived struggle. And the debate has escalated. Last week, on January 4th, a full-page ad appeared in the New York Times, declaring in bold letters, "No, in the name of humanity, we refuse to accept a fascist America." Appearing on Democracy Now! Recently, one of the co-signers, Cornel West, described Donald Trump as an indicator of what neo-fascism looks like. To quote West, "What is a neo-fascist? It's an American-style form of fascism. What I mean by that is we've had neoliberal rule from Carter to Obama. That neoliberal rule left in place a national security state. It left in place massive surveillance. It left in place the ability of the president to kill an American citizen with no due process. That's Obama. That was the culmination of the neoliberal era. Now you get someone who is narcissistic, which is to say out of control psychologically, who is ideologically confused, which is to say in over his head, and who does he choose? The most right-wing reactionary zealots, which lead toward the arbitrary deployment of law, which is what neo-fascism is about, to reinforce corporate interests, big bank interests, and to keep track of those of us who are cast as people of color, women, Jews, Arabs, Muslims, Mexicans, and so forth. And so, this is one of the most frightening moments in the history of this very fragile empire and fragile republic." That's Cornel West. Another one of the signers of the Times ad, Carl Dix, a founding member of the Revolutionary Communist Party, appeared with Cornel on Fox's O'Reilly Report. And we're going to play the 6-minute segment shortly as we start the show. We'll then spend the rest of the hour examining and trying to understand the complex history and dynamics of fascism with the renowned psychiatrist, activist, and author, Dr. James Gilligan. Jim was the lead author of the Rikers Report a couple years ago, which transformed the narrative at that institution, is an internationally recognized scholar in the field of violence, and has just returned from Israel, where he consulted with Israeli government and law enforcement officials concerning his ideas and policies on violence and terrorism. So let's start the Radical Imagination with this short segment of the O'Reilly Report and the discussion of fascism with Bill O'Reilly, Cornel West, and Carl Dix.
Sign the ad. Carl Dix, founding member of the Revolutionary Communist Party USA, and Dr. Cornel West, professor at Harvard University. So, Dr. West, I know you a long time. You're not willing to give Trump a chance? You don't want to see him maybe for 6 months and see what he does? You're not willing to do that?
I'm just afraid of the danger and the damage that he's already talked about. And when we talk about fascism, we're not talking about just an isolated individual who's president. We're talking about a strong man narcissistic personality, tied to big business, tied to big military, possibility of war, and slices of big media, because we know money itself plays a fundamental role in corporate media, that allows him to too often get away with
Well, why don't you? All right. I mean, that's your point of view. You're worried about him.
Well, it's not a point of view. It's the I think it's a matter of truth. What's true? Not,
but if it
not
were
true,
true, then he wouldn't have been elected. See, there's a lot of people who disagree. Wait.
The populace will vote for a fascist. Hitler was elected.
Why not give him a chance to see what he will do for a few months anyway? Why not do that?
People gave Hitler a chance, and we saw what that meant for humanity. And with Donald Trump, look at what we're talking about. Muslim registry, wall on the border with Mexico, law and order, which is code word for unleashing harsher repression against black and Latino people. Also a disregard for dissent and civil liberties. I mean, people who burn the flag, which is protected political speech, going to jail and losing their citizenship. His opponent in the election being threatened with jail. Reporters who were critical of him having to hire security. This is not only a program that's fascist, but an approach that will suffocate the room in society to oppose those
But
things.
again,
so that's why
all
we're
of
calling
those
on
things,
people to come
all
to the
of
streets
those
and
things
act
that
to
you
stop
say.
this
Wait.
regime before
you had a
it gets
chance,
started.
Yeah, you had a chance to stop it on Election Day, and it didn't work out in your way. So to me, I want everybody to be fair. All right? I don't think you have any historical context to compare Donald Trump to Hitler. I mean, Hitler had a record from 1927 on of violence.
So does Donald Trump.
No, he has no
record
record of
What about the
violence.
full-page ad calling for the execution of the Central Park Five that he did in 1990?
That is
5 young men who were framed,
That
and who he
is-
still thinks should be in
That
prison.
is rhetoric,
This man is real
not
clear.
violence. Look,
No.
you have to go on what happens, not as what is being said. Look, you're a communist, right? All right, you're a communist.
Yes, I'm a representative of the
Right.
Revolutionary Communist Party.
Right.
I tell
But
people
I don't
that.
condemn you because you're a communist. I don't do that. I wait and see what you, Mr. Nix, do. What do you do? Not
Okay.
that you're a philosopher.
And
Stalin
what I'm
was a
doing
communist.
what I'm doing right now is calling on people, because
You're calling on people to do what?
to come out into the streets, to manifest their anguish, fear, and outrage.
All right. And what are they going to do in the
everything that Donald
street? What do you
Trump
want them to do in the
represents.
street? What?
Protest,
In what
nonviolent
way?
civil
Nonviolent?
disobedience.
Just with signs and stuff?
Church congregations to do vigils
All right.
with candles in whatever
So that's
form
what
that
you
people
both
wanna
want.
do
You
it.
want a
And
mass-
we're calling for that.
A mass display.
We want a moral, spiritual awakening that
Right.
focuses on poor and working people, on women, on Mexicans, on Muslims, those who have been
And if that does
demeaned
not-
by Trump
if
and
that
others.
does not
And so we will
materialize-
on undocumented immigrants,
Right.
we will defend them. We will defend the women when it comes to closing down the place. We will defend those
If
who are
your
vulnerable.
vision does not materialize.
Yes.
Which I don't think it's going to.
No, we'll see if it
All right.
materializes.
But if it doesn't, then what's the next step?
We continue to struggle
The struggle for what?
for truth and justice.
Well, okay,
man.
so you come on programs like this and you
Yes.
give your opinion. That's fine.
it's
But
not
is there
just
any other
opinion.
element?
But it's
But
not just
also-
opinion, though. There are people suffering. Working people are suffering. Poor people are suffering. Women are suffering.
Yeah, but
Black people are suffering.
Trump has
Brown people are suffering.
promised to bring more jobs to
He's
alleviate the
already
suffering.
betrayed working people by bringing in Wall Street and Goodman.
all right, but
Goldman
that's just
Sachs and so
rhetoric.
forth.
Come on,
That's
Tom.
not rhetoric. That's
a
analysis.
promise
Go
of
ahead.
jobs
Yes.
that hasn't materialized yet, but a promise of jobs
He's not president
does
yet.
not excuse embracing a Muslim registry.
Well,
a
let's see if
border
the
wall,
Muslim registry happens.
bragging about sexual assault,
Oh, stop. It's
whipping up a lynch
ridiculous.
mob atmosphere.
You
It's
can
very
do
real.
that
At
to
his
any
rallies,
human
he
being.
said we should lay out these protesters. In the old days, we
I
could
think you're
do
both
that,
being unfair.
and I will pay your
Unfair in
legal
which way?
bills.
I think
Unfair in which way?
You
In which way,
got
by the
to
way?
see what he does in office. What he does.
But he's already talked about it.
Doesn't matter what he says.
Okay,
It's
see,
what he
you-
does.
You do history, Bill.
Unfair.
You're not actually
What about
looking
his
at it.
personnel?
Should
What about
people in
personnel?
Germany
What
have
about his personnel?
done what they
He has
did to
trouble.
give Hitler
Don't give me
a
Germany.
chance? I
Your
give you
communist
Germany.
crew
I give you
killed
Germany.
just as many in
No,
the
no.
Soviet Union.
First of all, that's
right?
not correct, and I
Yes,
can
it is.
talk
We
to you.
don't need to get into the
I gotta get out of here.
Bring me back to talk about that.
You guys aren't being fair.
But let's talk about the reality, and the reality
Aren't
is
being fair. No, okay? We gave you your
That
say.
isn't the question.
You gotta
We are
watch and see
talking
what he
about
does.
a fascist
We'll
regime,
see.
and you don't give fascism a
You
chance.
can label anybody that.
Everybody with
So
justice in their
when
heart
we return 3
should
months from
join
now,
us in the streets.
rights
These-
and
We'll
liberties
see.
curtailed,
We'll see.
continuing to demean Mexicans,
Gotta go.
Muslims, and women.
Gotta
Then
go.
we'll see. Then we'll see.
Directly ahead, one of the worst.
Wow. Jim, we need some help on this. That was quite a debate there. So what do we do here? What do we make of this sort of discussion? Are we in the throes of a fascist revolution, or a lot of loose talk? What do you say? How do you respond?
Well, let
to
me say that I approached this whole subject with a lot of caution about using words like fascism, or the even more inflammatory word Nazism, because the full-blown phenomena historically have been so far, beyond the scale of anything that we've seen yet in this country. Which is not to say that America doesn't have a history of more than enough atrocities. But when I look at Trump, because that's the subject really there, I can certainly understand the alarm and the worry that people feel about what he's going to do. But I think I'd have to say that at this point, I see him as having many characteristics and attitudes and values, given his statements, that are characteristic of fascist leaders in the past. On the other hand, I think there's a good reason to say that he's more of a potential fascist at this point than an actual one. And that doesn't mean we should do nothing. I think it does mean we need to ride herd on him, to monitor what he's doing closely, to comment about it in programs like this. And in the print media, in newspapers and magazines, on television, radio, and so forth. I think we need to be very alert to what's happening and follow it very closely. When I say that I think Trump has a lot in common with the attitudes that underlay the fascism of the 1930s and early 40s.
proclivities?
I'd say
Or how would you put it?
the way I'd put it, and the reason I speak of potential fascism, is after World War II had ended, a group of psychologists and psychoanalysts in America decided to explore the psychological preconditions that would turn some people into potential fascists. In other words, what were the personality, psychological characteristics that would make some people more vulnerable to the doctrines of fascism? And they developed a potential fascism scale. They called their study the Authoritarian personality. And what they were focusing on was the difference between authoritarian personalities versus egalitarian or equalitarian personalities. In other words, do you believe that human beings are divided into the superior and the inferior, and oneself should be in the superior group and all others are inferior? Or do you believe that, as our Declaration of Independence put it, all men are created equal? I should add all women. And that Trump's attitudes and values, as he's expressed them, are clearly anti-democratic, anti-equalitarian. He's condemned Mexican immigrants as criminals and rapists. He's condemned Muslims as a group, as a religion, and wants to keep them out of the United States. He's clearly a misogynist. That is to say, he believes in male supremacy, as expressed in his boasting about the fact that because he was a celebrity, he could grab women by the pussy. I mean, the vulgarity, the misogyny, the sort of male supremacy.
Portrayal as the strong man.
Yeah, that he's presenting himself with this kind of machismo,
Right.
which unfortunately was very appealing, apparently, to a lot of men who may doubt that they are man enough and who identified with this, quote, Superman, who can only brag about how he's superior to other people, superior to women, superior to Muslims, superior to Mexicans, and on and on.
Help us understand this a little better here. You're talking about an authoritarian personality. As I understood
Yes.
it, originally Adorno wanted to call it the totalitarian personality, right? Or am I correct on that?
Actually, that I don't remember for sure.
Okay.
But
And is that different than what we're talking about in terms of or is there such a thing as a fascist personality? Or a culture that breeds that? What are the components of that?
First of all, I would say that the underlying emotional and moral predisposition to fascism is a hypersensitivity to shame and humiliation, to any hypersensitivity to any indication that other people are criticizing you, laughing at you, insulting you, slighting you, and so on. I mean, this is one of the most remarkable characteristics of Donald Trump's personality, at least as it is revealed on television.
Right.
I mean, I haven't met him personally, and
Right.
I can't say anything here that would be based on that. But certainly anybody who, for example, if a president-elect, instead of focusing on affairs of state and the state of the world and the state of America in the world, is so upset by the fact that a movie actress criticizes him, and that's what he responds to.
Right. The humiliation, the perceived humiliation, which is then rooted in some sort of self-hatred?
Not self-hatred, but I'd say a lack of self-respect and self-esteem, a lack of feelings of self-worth. I'm talking about a personality, or say a character structure, which I and some other psychoanalysts have called a shame-driven personality. Somebody who is so concerned about the risk of experiencing shame and humiliation that they respond, well, the way somebody with sunburn responds if you slap them on the back. I mean, if somebody's not sunburned, you slap them on the back and they're perfectly happy with that. If you're sunburned, you jump out of your skin. Well, that's what Trump is like, psychologically. If you say anything that he experiences as denigrating him or criticizing him, he can't stand it. He immediately puts that in the center of his discourse rather than talking about the problems that the whole country, is facing, which he clearly is just not dealing with.
And yet he connects with so many people who are feeling similarly, or how is?
Well, I think he is connecting with people who feel that they themselves have been humiliated by our social and economic system, by our political system, and there absolutely are many people in this country who have in fact been shamed and humiliated by being subjected to unemployment or relative poverty, or simply a lack of being treated as equals. America, for example, has a higher degree of social and economic inequality than any other developed economy on earth. I mean, we are an outlier And there's no question that this creates a huge amount of distress and anger on the part of people who feel that they have been treated like second-class citizens. And unfortunately, Trump has succeeded in deceiving many such people into thinking that he would really be their friend rather than that he would be the friend of the richest 1% of 1% of our country.
So he's fooled the workers, as Cornell was pointing out, right?
Absolutely he has. And I think they will realize that in time. What I feel sorry about is that I feel that, that they will suffer in the meantime until Trump's term in office is over. Now, another characteristic that Trump has in common with fascism, which I say, again, makes him a potential fascist rather than somebody who already is fully a fascist, is that the attitudes and values he's expressed about violence, that he has so many times talked about preferring violence to nonviolence. For example, he has urged people at his rallies to engage in violence against protesters, and said they should rough them up or, send them out on a stretcher and so forth. With respect to how we treat enemy combatants, he's in favor of torture, saying that we should use waterboarding and much worse.
Comments about Hillary Clinton.
And he, in one of the most, frankly, to my mind, the most shocking single thing that he said in the last 2 years throughout the campaign was his implied expression of the potential that some of his followers could have to assassinate Hillary Clinton, when he said that if she is elected president, there's nothing we can do except maybe for some of the Second Amendment folks, meaning gun owners. Well, we don't, something like, we don't know what they can do, I don't know. So sort of.
Might have to take it into your own hands.
Yeah, but in other words, these are what are called dog whistles.
Yeah.
That the people with the guns who hate Hillary and think it might be a good idea to assassinate her, they get the message. It doesn't have to be said so explicitly that Trump could be blamed. What he does, what dog whistles are, is they create what's called plausible deniability. He could deny that he was encouraging people to assassinate Mrs. Clinton, Secretary Clinton. On the other hand, he really has put that idea in people's minds. He's put it on the radar screen or the television screen. Everybody can now think about the likelihood, whether it's greater or lesser, that somebody will take their gun and assassinate her. I mean, he's put that idea into people's heads. And that preference for violence, when he said, what good are nuclear weapons if we can't use them? One's jaw drops.
Right.
I mean, that's the kind of attitude that resulted in the overwhelming defeat of Barry Goldwater in the 1964 election, when he was saying that we should be willing to use nuclear weapons. But Goldwater was defeated in one of the most overwhelming landslides in our political history. Trump instead gets elected to the presidency, not in the popular vote, but in the electoral college vote.
Right.
So he was elected by primarily by people in the red states, like the Old South and the Wild West, where gun ownership is at its highest. So he's appealing to people who like to have guns and to use them. Trump was in favor of the death penalty for the so-called Central Park jogging criminals, and put a full-page ad in the New York Times saying that these young African-American men who had been arrested and wrongly convicted of raping and beating a young woman who was jogging in Central Park in New York City. Even after these, well, in the ad, he supported the death penalty for them. When it was later shown definitively by DNA evidence that they were innocent and that in fact railroading them into a conviction meant that the police actually missed the real offender, who then went on to assault several other people before he was finally caught and put in prison.
They were exonerated.
Yeah.
And he still couldn't.
And even
apologize.
after
We've
the supposed, these wrongly convicted young African-American men were exonerated, he has not backed off from that or apologized to this day.
We've had one of the, Yusuf Salam was on the show about 3 weeks ago, still hasn't received the apology. He's not holding his breath.
Yeah. So
that's another inability to say once you're sorry, or what's that? The sign
if
of
you are a
weakness, or
narcissistic personality, you are you feel so vulnerable to shame and humiliation. If anybody can point out that you ever made a mistake in your life, that you don't dare to acknowledge that you did. You have to actually have self-respect and self-esteem to admit that you made a mistake.
Wow.
Trump does not have enough self-esteem. I would say that's my psychological understanding of the kind of person that he at least represents himself as being on television. Now, if he happens to be privately and personally totally different from the way he presents himself on television, then I'd have to rethink some of what I'm saying. But I see no evidence that he's making it up or playing a game. It looks to me like he's just being himself, and that is what everybody who knows him says. That
and he's not aware of this. He's not. He can't stand outside himself in the sense of look at his thoughts.
Well, again,
sense,
I can't. Again,
from the
I'm not.
Right, I understand.
I can't read his mind, and I'm not trying to.
I understand.
To say that.
Okay.
I'm trying to say what I would say about somebody who walked into my office and behaved the way he behaves on television.
Fair enough.
That's all I'm saying. But I think it's important to talk about this because we're dealing with somebody who's going to be our president, in another 10 days, and the fate of the world is going to be affected by how he behaves in office. That's why I think it's important for us to build up every possible means of providing some countervailing power with which to place limits on what he can do, because certainly everything about him so far suggests that he will do whatever he can get away with. Now, one reason I call him a potential fascist rather than a real, definite, actual one yet is because his thought processes actually are so incoherent and scattered and fragmented and inconsistent and self-contradictory that he has so far shown himself to be incapable of even actually presenting any particular political philosophy.
So he's non-ideological in that sense.
He seems to not be capable of forming an ideology.
Coherent vision.
I mean, a coherent vision for the country, a coherent platform, a coherent set of policies that are consistent with each other. He has, been acting as though he could govern the country by the seat of his pants, by just from one day to the next, acting on whatever impulse strikes him that day.
But it's about money too, right? It's that he has a coherent vision of. It's about him and making more money.
Well, he does and doesn't.
Doesn't? No? Okay,
where I'd say he's incoherent is that he's not been willing to reveal any documentation of his money. He talks about it, he brags about it and boasts about being such a successful businessman, whereas everybody knows he's gone bankrupt time after time.
Right.
Nobody knows how much money he has. Many people, including Forbes magazine, which rates, the 400 or 500 richest people in the world, and many times in the past have differed very much from him as to what his net worth is. In other words, he has not presented a coherent, systematic, consistent, documented, open, examinable
So
summary.
you may be ashamed of that too.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
Well, let me put it. It is characteristic of people who feel hypersensitive to being shamed that they try to conceal themselves as much as possible. And he's doing that. He's concealing his business assets, his income tax, his net worth, and so on. And yeah, I mean, there are many reasons why we as a country and as citizens should be concerned about that, including the outrageous potential for conflicts of interest, that he could sell the interests of the United States down the river if he found that he could make more money by making some agreement with a foreign country that would benefit him, even though it might be grievously harmful to the citizens of
Possibly
the United States.
Even the Russians. Yeah. Not
Very
sure.
much, even the Russians. Yes.
Definitely.
So, his refusal to reveal these aspects of himself are consistent with his being a shame-driven personality who is more concerned about his own personal pride and self-respect than he is about accepting responsibility for this country and for its place in the world.
And capacity to nurture and to give and to be concerned about something beyond himself.
Yes.
The world out there, the environment, other than perhaps his small little family there or very close friends. I mean, so we're facing, I think, a dilemma that we've never really faced in this country.
There, I would agree with you. Trump is the kind of politician whom, look, I'm 81 years old. In my lifetime, I have never seen anybody comparable to him reaching that high an office as president of this country. This is unprecedented territory. This goes beyond the distinction between right and left, Republican and Democrat.
Yeah.
It's not clear what party he belongs to, except the party of Trump. And you talked about the egocentrism, the self-centeredness that he displays. The only thing that exists in the world, apparently, is his ego. And if his ego gets bruised by somebody disrespecting him, all he can think about is getting revenge and turning the tables by humiliating them. I mean, that's the reason that people humiliate other people, is if they feel they personally are vulnerable to humiliation. The way to defend against that is to humiliate somebody else instead.
Right.
And that is Trump's defense mechanism.
Create a scapegoat.
As we see it
Right.
in front of our eyes. I mean,
Right.
you don't have to speculate about this. You see it.
It's the truth.
Another
Honest,
aspect
yeah.
that where I think he does have something in common with fascism is the disregard for facts, the contempt for facts. One of the most brilliant theorists of totalitarianism, Hannah Arendt, in her magnum opus, The Origins of Totalitarianism, emphasized that one of the chief characteristics of totalitarian regimes, and fascism is a form of totalitarianism, that one of the chief characteristics of this is the contempt for facts, the attitude that facts aren't real, that they don't matter, that reality is simply whatever I say reality is. I won't be constrained or limited by empirical data or evidence. And I won't even be limited by what I said yesterday if I want to say the opposite today. What Trump reminds me of more than anybody else when it comes to his repeated willingness to just simply tell absolute out-and-out lies as to what he has said or done in the past. And when the truth of what he has said or done in the past is captured on video, on television, so you can see it.
Right. Mocking the disabled journalists.
Yeah. For example, with this recent thing with Meryl Streep, where she points out how he mocked the New York Times reporter who had a physical disability, and Trump denies that he mocked the reporter who had a physical disability, and yet all you have to do is look at the video tape of it, and
the actual reality.
That's what he's doing. I mean, there's just there's no other words in the English language to describe what he's doing except that. But he says, "Oh no, I didn't mock him." Well, what it reminds me of is a wonderful episode in one of the Marx Brothers movies, years and years ago, where one of the Marx Brothers is in bed with a woman who's not his wife. And his wife happens, though, to show up early and opens the door and finds him in bed with this other woman and says, you know, how could you do this? And he says, I'm not in bed with anybody. Who are you going to believe, me or your lying eyes? And this is what Trump is like. Who are you going to believe, me or your lying eyes? You look at the video of his mocking and attempting to humiliate the reporter, and then you hear him saying, who are you going to believe, me or your lying eyes? I mean, this is a characteristic of totalitarianism, and that's why we need a free and vigorous press and other media. That's why we need to be sitting here talking about this, reminding people of this. I mean, so that people don't forget it.
Because this individual is not to be reached, or by reason, by the data, by various forms of reality that most of us agree is going on. So we've got to create a support system here, in a sense, that doesn't enable things to get out of control. So then when Cornell and Carl are talking, and so many other people are talking about movements of resistance, to go back to the clip there, can you work with such an individual? Can you somehow accommodate or convince or in some way change that person?
I don't think that you or I or anybody else that I know is in a position to change Donald Trump. First of all, nobody can actually change another person. People can only change themselves. But we're not in a position, we're not his therapists, we're not in a position to change him. What I hope we can do is reach the public, reach our fellow citizens, our fellow voters, our fellow Americans, and keep the discussion going, keep the information going, reminding each other of what is reality, what is truth. I think that, well, I've spent a lot of my career trying to understand the causes and prevention of violence.
Right.
And I've learned to understand violence as a response to humiliation and an attempt to overcome humiliation by humiliating other people, by victimizing them. And I've concluded that the only alternative to violence is words. And you know, you can say that we're trading words here, and people are hearing words on their television set. But the power of words shouldn't be underestimated, because, as I said, they are the only alternative to violence. And I think it's really essential that we keep talking and thinking and reminding people of reality and reminding people of facts.
And especially with those in control or to have authority with the structures of violence, state violence, the military, the police, the prisons, and that you've certainly been working with extensively throughout your career. You just returned from Israel talking with various law enforcement and politicians and agents there, attempting to get them to change their attitudes and policies toward violence and being able to stop the cycles of violence.
Yes.
So you're talking about the same thing here as well. And so how do we make these ideas manifest themselves in police departments, in prisons, in the military? Because that's the step that we really have to avoid here, is to have to resist this full-blown fascism, and that is the violence, the political parties, the organized gangs that Hitler and Mussolini had to make sure that their ideas got implanted in the people. So, so your work is incredibly important here in breaking this cycle of violence, right?
Well, yes. I at least I've certainly devoted my life to developing programs to prevent violence and showing that violence can be prevented. I've done my research in prisons and jails with the most violent people, mostly men, that our society produces. And what I've discovered is you can prevent violence. And you begin that process by, first of all, making sure that your approach is not aimed at humiliating other people. And I'm talking about here about violent prison inmates. I learned that we only could prevent violence if we treated everybody we dealt with respect, regardless of who they were or what they had done, and gave them the tools they needed, the resources they needed, by which to gain enough self-respect and self-esteem that they wouldn't need to try to make up for their lack of self-esteem by dominating or violating other people. For example, we found in Massachusetts that there was one program which was 100% successful in preventing reoffending after prisoners left the prisons. And I'm talking about men who had committed murders or rapes, I mean, the most serious crimes. But of those who gained a college degree while in prison, not one was returned to prison over a 25-year period. The usual recidivism or reoffending rate among prison inmates is that about 2/3 get rearrested within 3 years. Here we had 0 over a 25-year period. Now, of course, that was a select group of the inmates, but as I said, their crimes were as violent as anybody else's. And on a larger scale, it has been shown that if you look at all forms of education, that education is the most powerful single tool for enabling people to give up a life of crime and violence and start becoming nonviolent, productive, tax-paying, responsible fellow citizens. Now, why is this? I think it's very understandable. There is no more direct route to self-respect and gaining respect from other people than gaining knowledge and skills that you can respect in yourself and that other people will respect and honor. So I'd say the first thing we should do with our jails and prisons is turn them into locked, secure, residential schools, colleges, and universities in which every inmate will be given the opportunity to get as much education as they are capable of, and that we will expect that they will take advantage of this opportunity, because my experience has been whenever we offer it, they do take advantage of it. The other thing I would say is that we need to understand that the best thing we can do for the victims of crime, and particularly violent crime, is to prevent them from being victimized in the first place. So we need to understand what are the social and economic and political forces and preconditions that either increase the rate of violence in America or decrease it. And what I've discovered, and many other people have, I'm far from being alone in this, is that the most powerful sources of increased violence, and I mean here both homicide and suicide, which increase or decrease together in America. The rates parallel each other. One goes up, the other does. One goes down, the other does. But since 1900, over a century now, since we first started measuring rates of lethal violence in America, suicide and homicide, what we have found is that both rates go up to epidemic levels when and only when the rate of unemployment goes up, the duration of unemployment goes up, the level of economic inequality goes up, of both income and wealth, and recessions and depressions are more severe and more prolonged.
This is true around the world, too.
And that's true around the world
Right.
as well, to the degree that it has been studied
Right,
in
right,
other countries.
right.
This finding just comes up over and over again. Now, one of the most interesting additional facts that I discovered is that these three economic stressors that stimulate violence, namely unemployment, inequality, and recessions, all have increased when Republicans have been elected to the White House and have decreased when Democrats have been elected to the White House, which is why the rates of suicide and homicide have decreased to way below the average levels for the century as a whole when Democrats are elected to the White House. Because at that point, inequality decreases, unemployment decreases, and recessions and depressions get undone or don't happen in the first place. So it's clear that Trump represents a risk of increased economic distress in this country, which in turn increases rates of suicide and homicide. When people are ruined economically, when their savings are wiped out, they lose their homes and become homeless, they get fired from their jobs. Those aren't just statistics. Those are human tragedies. And the people who suffer them suffer grievously. Now, obviously, only a tiny fraction become so desperate that they actually commit suicide or homicide.
Right.
But if even only 1 in 100 who is subjected to these kinds of stresses kills themselves or others, or often both, when our unemployment rate goes up, say to 10 million people, you suddenly have, you have 100,000 or 10,000. No, you'd have 100,000 more people committing suicide and homicide in that year. And I mean, this is just, outrageous.
Absolutely.
And
I just wondered also how you might respond to what you've just said to a recent editorial, actually January 8th, Crime and Gratitude in New York. Crime rate keeps falling in New York City and falling. The trend has held for many years, and not even 2016 broke the pattern. Fewer murders. The year ended with fewer than 1,000 shootings, a record low. There were fewer murders, 335, than in 2015. Fewer rapes, fewer burglaries, fewer robberies. Overall, 101,600 major category crimes were reported compared to 105,000. And what is striking, they go on to say, is how crime has fallen even as policing and criminal justice policies have drastically shifted. Crime fell when New York City officers were logging hundreds of thousands of stop and frisk encounters, and it fell when the department all but abandoned that unjust policy. it went down even as New York backed away from old tough on crime policies, sharply reducing the population of its prisons and jails. And it concludes by saying, persistence of falling crime tells us another story. New York is safer and calmer now than most of us can ever remember. And we should offer our gratitude to Mr. de Blasio and his commissioners, as well as the 34,500 officers of the department. They deserve a lot of credit. Now, do they, or are these, is it a more complex phenomenon we're talking about here in terms of some of the data you just mentioned?
Yes. I mean, the Times absolutely, of course, is right that rates of violent crime have diminished drastically, and that the imprisonment rates are going down. Well, they're not going down enough.
Right.
We need to, they're still bloated compared to where they were only 40 years ago. Mm-hmm. But it's true that the real forces that have the most powerful impact on rates of violent crime are not anything the police do or don't do, although obviously I think smart policing is better than dumb policing.
Right.
I mean,
Right.
you know, I'm not denying that there's a difference between, you know, an effective police department and an ineffective one, and I think
Understood.
I think the New York Police Commissioner and Mayor de Blasio deserve a lot of credit for the way they've handled the police force. But the real determinants here are the social and economic factors that lead to either these epidemics of suicide and homicide or to their diminishment to way below the average. Now, for example, Mayor Giuliani got a lot of false credit for the reduction in the murder rate in New York City when he was mayor. But what people often don't realize is that during the same years in which he was in office, it overlapped almost perfectly with the years when President Clinton was in office. Mm-hmm. And true to what I said about Democrats in the White House, under Clinton, the unemployment rate reached the lowest level in 30 years. Many other indices of social and economic equality increased. And the rate of homicide and other violent crimes went down in all 25 of the 25 largest American cities.
Right.
In other words, New York
Yeah.
City was only one
Right.
among 25, all of whom, without a single exception, had a dramatic reduction in the rate of violent crime during President Clinton's presidency. Because the prosperity was spread throughout the country, and much more equally. Now, Mayor Giuliani is like the rooster who thinks that its crowing made the sun rise. He was saying it was his mayoralty that led to this drop in the violent crime rate. In fact, many other cities who followed police practices that were the opposite of New York's had they had, you know, comparable levels of reduction in their rates of violent crime. For example, San Diego, where they emphasize not, you know, this kind of, I think, misapplication of the so-called broken windows theory, which led the Giuliani administration to start arresting people if they were wiping your windshield at a stop and so forth. I mean, this nonsense.
Yeah.
San Diego did the opposite. They emphasized collaborations between the community and the police, neighborhood crime watches. In other words, instead of trying to alienate the public and arrest as many people as possible,
And
they tried to
shame them
work,
and humiliate them more.
Exactly.
Right.
They tried to work with the population and say, look, we're trying to keep everybody safe here. You know,
Right.
if you have any problems, if you see any problems, let us know. We're your friends. We're here to help you and protect you. And they, lo and behold, the rate of...
And so are you also saying, and unfortunately we just have a couple minutes to go here, but I wanted to tie this into our discussion with fascism. So what you're saying here is what? That we can have policies, we can have political leadership, moral sensibility that can bring about a non-fascistic society.
Yes.
We don't have to resort to the sort of craziness that we're experiencing in the country at this point. Is that the
Yes.
argument in the last
Yeah,
minute or
I'm
so?
saying that these fascist approaches, one of the dog whistles for is sort of law and order. And you heard Trump in the campaign talk about how he's going to reinforce law and order and so forth, and he's in favor of the death penalty and all these things. That's the absolute opposite, wrong way to go.
Counterproductive, will lead to more violence.
It only stimulates violence.
Stimulates.
For example, the imprisonment rate in America, our unprecedented experiment in mass incarceration in America did not reduce the homicide rate in America by one.
Destroyed
one
families and lives.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, we're running out of time. Jim, I think you've clarified a lot of things for our audience. I want to thank you so very, very much. It's been a pleasure. We'll have you on again. And thank you so very, very much for watching us here on The Radical Imagination. This is Jim Vrettos. We'll see you again next week. Take care.